Welcome to Legal Meets, a look at legal beyond the law. A podcast by LegalMeets. On this episode of Legal Meets, we meet Mark Cohen, a prolific entrepreneur, thought leader, educator, and writer on the state of the legal industry. Mark is the CEO of Legal Mosaic, consulting and advising the legal industry and some of its most successful companies. Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Legal Meets. Thank you for joining us. I'm joined by Mark Cohen in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us, Mark.
Pleasure to be here, Stevie.
It's evening your time, so you're just winding down, and I've just come from a boxing class and about to pass out. But how's your day going?
So far, so good. I'll put the wine glass to the side.
Yeah, right. Okay. I've got a boring water on this side, so not much fun. But thanks for joining us, and we always start the actual show by trying to get a view into the life behind the lawyer, and I'd love to know a little bit more about what your interests are. So if TED Talks got in touch with you tomorrow and said, Mark, we want you to present, and it couldn't be about legal, what would you actually talk about?
Oh, gosh. Could be a lot of things, Stevie, but I would say probably one of the things that's high on my list now would be the difference between success and failure. How do you know which is which? And I think anyone who has been an entrepreneur or who desires to be one should recognize that sometimes the difference between one and the other is not altogether that clear.
It's interesting because even in the startup world, you've got, I guess, people looking at other startups and seeing them on the front cover of TechCrunch and then comparing it to their lowest point. So you've got this disparity of like success and failure. And that happens in all kinds of walks of life in business, like someone's barometer is quite different to yours. So is that something that you find that there's quite this disparity between what someone considers a success and what someone else considers a failure?
Well, I think, listen, when I was a lawyer, success was really very easily measured. It was by the quality of the clients that you had, the amount of business that you were able to get, by the adulation of your peer group, or the enduring enmity of your peer group who were jealous. It's the same thing. But I think as I've kind of gone along in my life and I've gone into the business world, I realized that very often, some of the best work that you do is not necessarily a financial success initially. But it does give you great chops with people who, kind of follow the industry. And if you have the resolve to learn and go forward, from things that did not work out quite the way you might have planned, they can turn out to be some of your greatest triumphs. In my case, I guess I would point to Clearspire as an example of something that had, certainly tremendous market recognition. I think, I'm very proud of what we achieved intellectually. It was not the financial success that some, including myself, expected it to be, but I learned a hell of a lot from the experience. And I think that that's got a value, and I wouldn't be surprised if sooner or later the unfinished business of Clearspire might not turn out to be a financial success too.
It might still transpire.
You never know.
Yeah, there's Bill Gross who's got a video, actually a TED Talk, and he compares, again, he's invested in a multitude of startups, been very successful, and he compares 200 startups, and it comes down to basically, you've got the Ubers and the Airbnbs, but also 100 of his investments. And they rate them with the team, the funds, the idea, and there's also another category, timing. And time after time, like that is the most important thing. Like literally, the key success driver is timing. So you can have a great idea, but Uber wasn't able to connect people without the Google Maps on the driver's dashboard guiding him around without a map. So maybe it was a case of too soon.
And that's why I think, Stevie, that very often people tend to, dismiss people as failures, those who might have had really great ideas where the timing was not quite right, and just label them as a failure. And in my mind, they might be anything but. That is to say that, and again, I think everything, forgive me for being parochial and being very American for a moment, but you know, I've been a lifelong baseball fan, and I've always thought that life imitates baseball. Baseball, interestingly, is in its second generation of metrics and you know, very advanced statistics. Law is barely entering into its a first generation,
Right.
and baseball, you know, has kind of gotten to the point where it's now measuring the true impact on team performance of individual performance. And I think that's very interesting, because if you were, for example, to talk about the Clearspire example, you would see that I think that it has had a pretty profound impact on, you know, the industry, even though it was not itself at the time a great financial success. So again, you come back to the question of how does one measure success and failure?
Yeah, yeah. So you didn't become a baseballer, and you ended up becoming a lawyer, and hopefully you can say a successful one, and you're still going. What was there a moment that, you know, kind of it all crystallized for you? And again, I'm very interested in kind of what drives people to become, you know, a lawyer in the first instance. Was there one kind of moment that kind of shaped your career?
Well, yes. I guess what shaped my career is law is was long a profession that was not given to mercurial rises. I was very fortunate to have had a mercurial rise as a lawyer. I had tremendous experience as a trial lawyer, as an assistant U.S. attorney. I tried 21 major federal lawsuits, including a major class action at a time when no one really knew what a class action was,
Yeah.
that went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. I argued, you know, well, I was a part of a 3-lawyer trial team that tried a 9-week case in federal district court. I argued a case to the federal district court, and went all the way up to the Supreme Court. So I had great experience. Translation, I then became a partner at a major law firm, never having been an associate. And the managing partner of the firm, who was kind of a visionary in the legal industry, Steve Cumble, taught me a lot about what was good about big law and what was, I thought, not so good about big law. And when I was able to successfully get a class action dismissed on a motion to dismiss, meaning that the $6 or $7 million legal reserve that the client had set for defense costs was to go out the window, I was expecting Mr. Cumble to give me a tremendous congratulatory salute.
Yeah.
Instead, he cursed at me in a way that would probably make most stevedores blush, saying, "What kind of a partner are you?" I realized then that, you know, one of the great drivers of the big law model was economics. It was not necessarily, you know, the value to clients.
Right.
Not to say that all big law firms are that way, but just to say that at a very early age, I realized, you know, that sometimes the interests of the law firm economically and the interests of the clients are not all that well aligned.
Right. And so that would have been quite rare for someone to join straight into a partnership, right? Not working their way up the ranks of the, you want to call it a pyramid model, whatever it is. That was that quite a shock in the first instance, as like, how did I end up here?
Well, I wasn't shocked, but I think a lot of my partners were shocked and not terribly pleased, I might add.
Yeah.
But you know, I think that I was always someone who I think was interested in challenging traditional notions of a very, very conservative profession and a very, very conservative industry. And you might ask, how did you get into that, with more of a, kind of an innovator's or a creative bent? And the answer was that prenatally I had two choices. Either I was going to be a doctor like three generations of my family, or a very good lawyer. Those were my only choices. Had I had other choices, I probably would do what my older daughter has done and become a Hollywood scriptwriter. But that's another story.
Well, it seems like the writing runs in the genes. So I'll just get rid of this on my screen. And so you obviously I saw a really good comment by yourself that about your writing, and that was that if you're not a good writer, be a prolific one. And you're definitely doing a great job of that. And you've got articles in Bloomberg, you've got articles in Forbes, and again, just a broad commentary about all aspects of the legal industry. But before we talk about the future of I guess the legal industry, I wanted to kind of get your take on kind of where things are at. And you've got the Georgetown Law Center's kind of report that comes out, the Trends Report, and obviously you're a lecturer there, and speaks about the 10 years of stagnation, which is obviously quite clear to see. You don't have to be a genius, but it's fallout, I guess, from GFC, with a multitude of other factors as well, including technology. But what's you're talking to all the different stakeholders in the industry, from universities to the small firms, large firms. What are you getting a sense of out there? What's the actual zeitgeist of kind of what's going on?
Love the word zeitgeist. I would say that in terms of the stagnation term, it really depends on whose perspective you're considering. If it's the perspective of the law firm, yes, it's been stagnant over the last 10 years, but that doesn't really tell the story. I think the real story, Stevie, is that through a confluence of large global socioeconomic factors, specifically, I would say the incredible ascent of technology and its metamorphosis from a vertical to a horizontal that permeates the way we live and work, across virtually all facets of life. You combine technology with the global economic crisis of 2007, which I think created a reboot of buy-sell dynamic. And suddenly you have the mantra of better, faster, cheaper in all things. And I think that and globalization and the fact that, as Tom Friedman wrote in 2004, the world is flat. The technology was starting to not only make changes on its own, but allow people to, in knowledge-based industries like law, to create labor arbitrage. That all of that has really led to profound changes in law. And when you consider that back in 2007, there was no smartphone, SaaS was in its infancy, there was no Uber, Amazon, was really bore little resemblance to what it is today. And you fast forward today, even lawyers with their great hubris shouldn't be surprised to think that there was going to be a real change in terms of the way legal services are delivered. And I often cite the medical profession, which sort of shifted 20, 30 years ago from medical practice to the healthcare industry. Why should lawyers think that they would be any different?
Yeah, and there's some interesting business models that kind of come in and out from like the legal insurance kind of model that's popping up. Because you got scale now, you got technology to kind of serve a lot of people. All of a sudden, I know I've spent more on legal fees this year than medical fees, so that I'd be one putting my hand up if there was something like that locally. But again, what you described sounds like a bit of a boiling frog, where this tech being proliferated, it's kind of happening every day. It's just like the bar keeps moving, and before you know it, you were maybe in an industry, some say, that hasn't changed for 4,000 years, but this last 10 years has been quite radical.
Well, and I would say one other thing, Stevie, in terms of the stagnation term, I think that's a little bit of an irony because I would say that law was for 4,000 years or, from the Code of Hammurabi,
Yeah,
however long ago that was, that it was indeed stagnant, but the last 10 years have,
the opposite, right?
really, really been very different. And that what you're seeing finally is that, the legal guild or the legal island, however you want to refer to it, has been this sleepy hollow controlled by lawyers, created by lawyers for lawyers, is suddenly turning into this very sexy kind of marketplace where all these new entrants are coming in. You have new models, you have technology, you have an excitement that is suggesting that maybe there is big change for this trillion-dollar global legal industry that is law.
It's funny that you frame it that way because it is the total opposite, right? This last 10 years is the state of flux. It's kind of like picking up more velocity. And before that, it was a long period of stagnation. So it's an interesting way to put it. And so you recently released an ebook, titled Essays on on Legal Delivery. And, you comment and you kind of made a few analogies in there, the Reggie Jackson one and basically, again, the baseball thing, right? And then saying it's a new ball game. So, a lot of things have changed. You've got, alternative, business models. You've got LPOs, limited licensed legal technicians in Washington State. All kinds of things like, from legal Zooms and AI and chatbot and, all the things you're hearing about more often now, like machine learning. So what is it that, I mean, for a lawyer, it probably sounds like the Wild West, right? Someone that's been doing the same thing for a certain period of time. What does this all mean for, all this kind of new technology and platforms and business models? What does it mean for, I guess, the law firms?
Well, I think it means a lot of things. So let's try to break this down. First of all, I think, sort of the most significant thing that's happened, in my opinion, is that the great myth that lawyers are the ones who determine what is and what is not a quote unquote legal task, that only lawyers are equipped to handle legal tasks, and they are by the ones that determine what is and what is not legal, and that presumptively all things emanate from all legal work emanates largely from law firms, and that the myth of legal exceptionalism and the myth that all legal work is somehow bespoke or customized. All those things are kind of going out the window. And they've really gone out the window within the last 10 or 20 years. And to your question of what does that mean for law firms, I think it means several things. Number one, law firms used to drive the bus. Law firms used to have a virtual stranglehold over the delivery of legal services. And indeed, the practice of law was until 10 or 15, 20 years ago synonymous with the delivery of legal services. They were one and the same. Now, consumers, not lawyers, are saying what is legal and what is not legal, what requires lawyers' direct intervention and what does not. What can be handled by other professionals, what can be handled by paraprofessionals, and what can be handled by a combination of human resources and technological resources. Those, sort of division of labor questions are all being determined largely by legal consumers. In the first instance, by in-house legal departments who've seen an enormous migration of work away from law firms to them. But I would argue that that is a palliative, not a cure, for what's wrong with legal delivery. I think that the real cure is going to be when the legal industry and legal consumers decide that law is not just about lawyers anymore. You have to separate legal practice. That is, I would define that, Stevie, as differentiated legal expertise, judgment, or skill sets that some but not all lawyers have. That is what I would define as practice. And legal services is really everything else. It is the business of leveraging legal practice and augmenting that with technology and process to be able to deliver it more efficiently, more accessibly, more cost effectively, and to allow those practice skilled individuals to collaborate with others in the legal supply chain, with the end result that legal services, whether corporate or retail, are far more accessible, affordable, and efficient and predictable than they've been.
Yes, I mean, to your point, one of the things, just even ourselves as a company, we're trying to work on is, consumerizing that vehicle that kind of lets a lawyer deliver their services. So, everything's moving from paper to kind of the digital realm, and, making it more, I guess, shortening the distance between a lawyer and a client, and building that kind of, I guess, conduit is kind of something that, that we're working on. But to your previous point about the, I guess, convergence of other, people, I guess the big accounting firms is one example. You got the big four there. What do you think the reason these guys are now saying, hey, there's an opportunity in legal? What would make like a PwC or Ernst and EY, like Ernst and Young, kind of go, hey, we should really expand our, start hiring some lawyers? What do you think that's happening?
Well, let's start with the fact that they already have expanded, and collectively the big four accounting firms employ approximately 10,000 lawyers globally. So if you were to sort of take that total, if you take aside Denton's, which I think is subject to question as to what do you call it. Do you call it an association? Do you call it, I could see a lot of descriptors being applied, but if you take Denton's out of the mix, and take the next four largest firms by headcount, the big four are roughly the same size, right? And by the way, have very similar structures in that, they are Varines, or a version of a Varine, meaning that each of their members have their own P&L. But I think what it says for law firms is that law firms are in for competition that they have not previously had to deal with from other professional service companies. I wouldn't be surprised if the Accentures of the world were not to jump into the legal arena, possibly even the McKinseys. And you're also seeing companies like Elevate, like United Lex, Axiom, who are becoming, very significant players in the legal marketplace, but they do not have traditional law firm partnership structures. They're much more corporatized. They are much more tech-enabled. They are much more process-enabled. And frankly, they have a DNA that I think more closely resembles business than traditional law firm partnerships.
We got this bottom-up kind of, again, it kind of meets in the middle, but you've got, again, the example you gave, like an Elevate. I think that's the fastest growing area of the legal industry, right? LPOs and kind of those service providers. And basically, they're coming in with a different DNA, one that can move really quickly, one that's business orientated, and then kind of bringing on the legal services as a top layer to say, hey, this is what we sell. And then, I think the law firms are watching that going, hey, they're kind of, eating our lunch. So they're trying to shift, but it's probably harder for a law firm to shift, obviously.
There's no question. It's sort of like, what's easier, to retrofit a Georgian house and make it into a contemporary house, or, to have a plot of land and say, I want to build a contemporary house. And just to return to Elevate for a minute, Liam Brown made an interesting comment where he described recently Elevate as a law company. And full disclosure, I am the chairman of their board of advisors and chief strategy officer. But having said that, I think that that's really interesting, because I do think that to describe a company like Elevate as an LPO is a misnomer. I really do think that it is a law company. And again, I would not be surprised. We had talked about Clearspire earlier. Clearspire was both a legal services company, aka a law company, and a law firm. I would not be surprised if, going forward, you don't see more law companies becoming also law firms and melding the two.
Yeah, I think even, again, Axiom probably falls into that bucket as well, because you've got so many different kind of layers. One's a technology layer, one's this kind of, again, network kind of effect that we've got happening as well, and then parachute kind of counsel. So law company seems to be, LPO is probably a misnomer and kind of quite my opposite. Yeah.
I think the important thing is, notwithstanding the nomenclature, and I think the industry is still struggling with what the right descriptors are. I think the important thing is that what you're seeing is that technology and process and access to outside capital and corporate structures are creating different kinds of delivery models that are servicing customers in very different ways. And note, I use the word customer rather than client. And I think that as time goes on, sort of lawyers, insistence upon client. I think that there will always be clients for practice issues, but I think from the customer perspective, what they're increasingly concerned about is not so much how they're described, but the means by which providers are able to address their business challenges that may happen to raise some legal issues. They're not looking for legal tomes. They're looking for answers to business challenges.
Yeah, and that's precisely, I think that the best advocates are the ones that kind of have that business acumen and solving business problems, again, with a legal air. So
yes.
that goes to, again, delivering value. I guess that's the underlying thing
right.
a customer wants to receive.
Well, and one other thing, if I may, Stevie, it's delivering value from the client perspective. And that is, clients assign different values to different matters. Lawyers historically have taken the view that, my job is to turn out the best possible memo, the best possible motion, the best possible research. Everything that lawyers do is based on creating the Sistine Chapel ceiling of that particular task. But from a lawyer, from a client's perspective, that's not always the case, of course. Clients are interested in, sometimes good is good enough for clients.
So it's kind of it's a bit of a rabbit hole, so we probably won't fall too far into it, but there's the whole pricing and the value thing that, again, this conversation that you probably get pulled into more often than not. And going back to value, do you think is that paradigm, is that just like an old conversation now about, the hourly, billing kind of, well, that's still increasing, right? Yeah, I think up in New York it was up to like $1,500 US. So is that conversation done?
Well, interesting. I think that probably ironically, and I wrote about this in my Forbes piece today, ironically, most everybody except lawyers will agree that lawyers are too expensive. One of the salient exceptions might be lawyers at the highest rung of pricing. And why, you might ask, and that's because they do have, the differentiated skills and expertise and judgment that is necessary in sort of so-called bet the company matters that are by nature price insensitive. So whether a lawyer charges $1,500 or $2,000, when you're talking about matters that affect the brand or billions of dollars, not even a rounding error.
Yeah. The Apples of the world and whatever, there's always going to be a demand. So people use that as the yardstick and go, oh, wow, there's someone still charging $100 and getting more.
But one thing that I always asked, and this is going back, 35 years ago as a lawyer, my first question to a client, and these are big clients, and I was at the company trial lawyer, and I would be presented with, a large class action that I was being tasked to defend. But even with that backdrop, the first question I would ask the client was always the same: what's your objective? Because what the client's objective is going to color, how I am going to strategically go about managing their representation. Yes. And sometimes their strategy might be, no, we have to pursue a scorched earth. But sometimes they would say, well, no, this case is pure nuisance value. Let's get rid of it. So I think that, from a practice perspective, that's always been the case. It's just that, frankly, most lawyers don't tend to ask that question.
Yeah. So there's a case of client outcomes getting more closely aligned to what obviously the lawyer's outcomes are, and there's also meeting in the middle. You've got the value kind of conversation, and which is tied to that as well. So yes. Is that something that, again, I mean, you're advising, speaking, is that something that you're trying to really, if that comes across, do all the other things fall into place? Because if you're trying to deliver value and less about running the meter, like the taxi driver analogy you gave previously, is that something that will drive, how do we deliver more value? So then we better look at what technology we can use as a vehicle to actually deliver value, not so much to wear a badge of honor to say, hey, we've got this new technology that does kind of like AI and whatever else. Is that the initial thing? Technology,
Stevie, in my opinion, technology is like evidence, okay? There are certain pieces of evidence that are, potential evidence that are wholly irrelevant. They're not admissible, because it's just a flash in the pan. The prejudicial value outweighs the probative, impact. But and technology is the same way. I hear people say, oh, I've got this great technology. I'm this startup. And I ask the question, well, what is the particular challenge or problem that the technology is designed to, address? And they look at me like, well, why would you ask that? It's great technology. Yeah. And so I think that technology and the development of legal technology is a team sport. It has to involve technologists, but it equally has to involve ultimate users of the technology. And it has to match up, sort of what the technology is and the problem or problems that it is, going to be addressing.
It's almost going to be, and AI is coming that way as it matures, but it's almost going to be like electricity, right? It's kind of doing its thing there in the background, but it's almost like it shouldn't be that noticeable. It's kind of like,
right. I think the best technology is technology that is user-friendly, easy. I would cite as an example the iPhone, right? The iPhone is something that, is hard, tremendously complex, behind the touch screen, but for the user, it's very easy and it's very intuitive, and they just switch from thing to thing. That's the beauty of it, and that, in my mind, is a great example of what technology can and should be.
That's probably a good analogy also for legal services from the client perspective. Is like,
absolutely,
let it be complex as it needs to be behind the scenes, but for them, it should be from the billing.
They're not interested in, the intricacies of the legal supply chain and how this meshes with that. They're just interested in, do I have a simple one-touch integrated end-to-end solution? And the person who comes up, or the organization that comes up with that, is going to do very well.
Like you said, and I think Dennis Kennedy likes to always frame the technology he's looking at in that question is like, what problem am I hiring you to solve? And that's both the technology and the lawyer, right? Like, as you said, the outcomes. Yeah.
Yes, okay. Absolutely. In that sense, I think that technology and lawyers are positively aligned. When people used to hire me as a lawyer, I would say that there were two things that they wanted me to do. One was to get an immediate problem off of their plate. Okay, but the second and much overlooked thing that now I think technology is starting to do is they have acquired intellectual capital that has been produced as a consequence of getting that problem off their plate. They should be able to access that intellectual capital anytime and for any purpose they need it, not just for that particular case. That's one of the things. Yes, that's one of the things that we strive to do with Clearspire's technology, is make that intellectual capital readily accessible on a 24/7, 365 basis.
Yeah, otherwise it's sitting in a silo, like, of, not doing much. Okay. And so, I mean, again, breaking it down and just, for law firms, lawyers listening, and again, I'm going to share your ebook in the show notes, because it's a really brilliant take on. I think it hits a lot of different areas that are just pertinent to every lawyer out there right now.
Thank you.
And it doesn't it gets into the weeds on some elements, but it's just a really great overview of what's happening in the industry, how you can actually, I guess, change your practice really quickly by delivering value. So, what is just, if you want to kind of share a little bit of wisdom on what lawyers can do tomorrow to actually, okay, I'm gonna kind of change lanes a little bit and kind of start focusing on delivering value. What's something they can do tomorrow to kind of improve the delivery of their service?
Well, for the law firm perspective, I'll break it down, if I may, into law firms and individual lawyers. So for law firms, I would counsel them to take a long, hard look in the existential mirror and say, what is it, that we are that is in some fashion differentiated? Because the days of law firms operating as undifferentiated big box stores are over. And so I think law firms have to look at what practice areas they excel in. I think they have to look at also how they are able to pair their practice differentiated expertise with a delivery capability. Now, very few law firms seem to have that delivery capability in-house. I would cite as one example of a firm that does, Allen & Overy. But there aren't many that I've come across that I would put in that category. And I think from an individual lawyer perspective, I think that individual lawyers are going to have to, first and foremost, they have to learn their craft. And by that, I mean that, they have to really be able to practice in at least one area in a way that, is designed to drive value, not just to do research, not just to be able to do support work, but to really be able to drive differentiated practice value. I think that most lawyers, would be wise to go back and to learn a new suite of skills. I think they should begin to learn a little bit about the business of law. Probably the best overview of the business of law and what the competencies are that comprise that would be to go on the CLOC website. The consortium of corporate legal operations groups, and they list 12 competencies.
All right.
Analytics, collaboration, project management, those sorts of things. I think that, all lawyers today should have a look at that. I'm not saying that they're necessarily going to be able to master all those things, but at least have a high-level understanding of how those competencies are, being melded with practice expertise, in legal delivery today. Because make no mistake about it, I think that the economics of legal practice and the way legal services are being delivered is anything but stagnant. And I think that it is I think that what's happening is that a lot of people have been talking about when are we, going to, kind of reach a tipping point? I don't know whether we've actually reached it or not, but it's beginning to look like a lot like we are. In the spirit of Christmas, it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas. It's beginning to look like we're reaching that tipping point. And I think that rather than, sort of being the proverbial deers in the headlight, lawyers are not going to be put out of business. But a lot of lawyers who are working at large law firms today may not be working at large law firms 2-3 years from now.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, the key word I can pull out of that is differentiation. Obviously, what we spoke about at the top was these other people coming in, these other entities and stakeholders kind of, again, taking the lawyer's lunch. But if you're not differentiated, you're letting them obviously come to the table with with what you're actually doing as well. So it seems that the key that they should be looking for is, how do I differentiate myself? And that can be branding, how they talk to their consumers, how their clients actually on their website, so the language they use to offer their services, right?
I think that social media, for example, and branding offer opportunities that frankly weren't available when I was a baby lawyer. And I think that, I think that lawyers should also look to some of the other skill sets and passions that they have as human beings that were meaningful to them before they became lawyers. And rather than putting those in the rear view mirror, put them in the passenger seat and try to marry them with their personae as lawyers. I think that's very important.
It's such good advice. I've seen, like, again, the lawyers that do that successfully really stand out from both, again, a branding perspective. Their passion really comes across in all their marketing and website. And again, that's sometimes the only touch point you have with a client, right? Because they're coming online to find a lawyer. So it really makes a big difference. And so,
when I was a managing partner of 2 firms, I always used to tell people a couple of things. One is don't check your humanity at the door. And don't think that just because I'm the managing partner, I have a monopoly on all the good ideas.
Yeah, right.
And I think that that's really, really important for lawyers to know.
Yeah, I think it's almost like dial up the humanity, right? Because someone's coming to you generally in a time of need or trouble, and they want to really connect with someone that understands what they're kind of going through. So
I think paradoxically, Stevie, that as technology becomes more and more embedded in the process of delivering legal services, somewhat counter-instinctively, that soft skills, people skills, EQ, becomes even more important today than it's ever been.
Yeah, and that's a good segue, because one of the things that's looming in the background and again causing a lot of, I guess, fear in the industry is this, AI notion creeping up, and it's evolving. Essentially, there's a couple conversations. One is, the augmented lawyer, where, as you mentioned, a lawyer can get to what they're good at. It's, the technology, again, like the electricity, should just do what it does, and let the lawyer not do the boring stuff, the repetitive stuff, the stuff you mentioned, kind of, gets ad nauseum, kind of a bit boring for them as well, and add value as an advocate. So where do you see this playing out? I mean, one of the questions that we kind of always end up discussing on the show is, in 5 to 10 years' time, there's going to be more lawyers, there's going to be less lawyers. So again, AI looming in the background, automation. What do you see the landscape looking like?
Well, what I would like to see is, I would like to see law solve its distribution problem. Many years ago, a lawyer and former president of Harvard University, Derek Bach, famously wrote that there's too much law for those that can afford to pay for it, and too little for those that can't.
I love that.
I would like to see, lawyers fully and gainfully employed, representing all those in need of legal services. That's not the case today. And I think it's really one of the, blights on the industry and the profession. So I would say that so long as everyone in the society that needs legal services has access to them, And so long as we're able to, kind of deliver legal services on different price points, commensurate with value, commensurate with complexity, commensurate with supply and demand. These are things that I think, are most important, rather than to say we need more lawyers or fewer lawyers. I do think that we probably need fewer lawyers with the expectation of working at large, corporate type law firms. And I think that we need to, kind of revive the notion and the social compact of some lawyers, at least, recognizing, hey, I have to, do something about access to justice. And by the way, law schools have to play a role in this too, because they're just too damn expensive. But that's probably another subject for another session.
Well, again, there's this rationalization that's got to happen, because you've got technology disrupting. You've got, again, this, I think this, the stat that gets thrown around is still 80% of people that experience a legal issue can't get help. So between that and, excess, like, lawyers still from the GFC, right? Law students and everyone else looking for a job, there's got to be this rationalization, right? Prices have to kind of come down and things have to kind of rationalize. So as opposed to fearing things, I think it's going to open up the industry. So what you're saying is that there's a long way to go before it becomes a problem where people aren't getting serviced and, lawyers are getting left in the dark.
Right.
All right, awesome. We're going to have to let you get to drinking your wine and getting on with your evening. It's quite late. But we've got a few quick fire questions just before you go, and that we normally finish off with. And I just wanted to know, are you an Android, a Windows, or an iOS guy?
Well, I would say I couldn't give an expletive, but it doesn't particularly matter to me, but I guess I'd have to say Windows.
All right, okay, cool. And apart from your computer and your phone, is there another bit of technology or something that kind of maybe for your writing, but is there something that you can't live without?
Oh, a piece of technology?
Yeah, just something in your life that it could be anything. Could be something you use to track your exercise. Could be whatever. Is it something that you?
Oh yeah. Well, I would say the technology is the automatic coffee maker. It enables me to be a hero. Both to myself and to my wife. I get up at a ridiculously early hour. The coffee is ready. I start to write, and about an hour later, I go up and bring my wife a cup, and I'm as much a hero as I'll ever be.
You're in the good books. Okay. So that was actually going to be my next question. Is there a ritual? But it sounds like, again, most writers have, the flow state and whatever else. So are you more of the, it sounds like the cup of joe in the morning and you get the juices flowing early on?
Well, yes, but I also, I have other rituals dating back to my competitive athletic and trial days. But one of them is I love to take a long walk every day. It really grounds me. It gives me a chance to think and observe nature and realize that, the stuff I do on my computer or on the phone or stuff, it is just stuff I do. But there are other things to think about, and it gives me a little bit of perspective.
Yeah, no, it's such a simple thing, but again, so powerful, from clearing your thoughts to
It kind of goes back, to the whole issue of don't check your humanity.
Yeah.
I think it's very important, to take inventory on your humanity and what's important to you.
Just a daily reset button. That's great. Okay.
Yeah.
It's been wonderful chatting with you, and again, we've got plenty more to talk about, so we might have to get you on again. And again,
my pleasure. Maybe we'll even do it earlier in the day, Stevie.
Yeah, no worries. Maybe we should do it later in my day, early your day. So I've got the beer on the table, and you can have a water or your coffee. So that'll work.
I like that. You're on.
All right, Mark. Have a great evening, and thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. And see you next time.
My pleasure. Take care, Steve.